Good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here, and a very great pleasure and honour to introduce Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad. A Fellow of the British Academy, Ram-Prasad is Distinguished Professor of Comparative Religion and Philosophy, as well as Deputy Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Arts and Social Science at Lancaster University. He studied politics and history in India before his DPhil in philosophy at Oxford. He held research fellowships at Oxford and Cambridge before joining Lancaster. He has written some 60 papers in a wide variety of areas and 7 books so far. His 2014 book, Divine Self, Human Self, The Philosophy of Being in 2 Gita commentaries, won the Best Book 2013-14 award of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. His most recent book, Human Being, Bodily Being, Phenomenological Case Studies from Classical India, was published by OUP in 2018. He has been writing in recent years on emotions in classical Indian thought, and is currently writing a book on love and loss in Sanskrit literature, building to a reconfiguration of assumptions about masculinity. In this 2025 series of Stanton lectures, Ram will be tackling what is perhaps the issue at the very core of both religion and philosophy, the relationship between unity and plurality, between the one and the many. Many religions have been dualistic to some degree, and yet the bias of religion is surely towards a seeking of order or oneness. We experience life as diverse and fragmented, and yet we yearn to unify things, to render them coherent. Some forms of atheism and materialism are perhaps at bottom resigned to an embrace of incoherence or plurality. There are simply many clashing atoms, for example, or an original diverse chaos, with any arising order but an accident. The religious impulse, by contrast, seeks hidden or partial order as more fundamental than confusion. This is not merely wishful thinking, because if our common experience is of a puzzling diversity, we also know that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and that if all we perceive or experience is a mere passing blur of radical differentiation, we would not be able to survive at all. In this sense, there is a certain bias to the positive. Unified things and events and the unity of being itself are, after all, primary in our lives. Negative confusion and the consequent need for repair, itself the attempt to restore unity, are perforce secondary. If we cannot explain these unities, and yet we nonetheless intuit or encounter them, then this may suggest that a mystical submission to and fusion with what exceeds our normal comprehension or rational understanding is not so peculiar after all. It is common to see a considerable gulf between Eastern and Western religions, the latter apparently more concerned with distinct personality and with difference in general. Yet there can never be any great distance between monotheism and monism, and there is more monotheism in the East and more monism in the West than is sometimes allowed. And as our speaker will demonstrate in these lectures, often the same tensions regarding how to construe ultimate unity are found in China, in India, and just as in Islam, in Judaism, and in Christianity. If all things proceed from the absolute one, then what is the status of these finite other things which so proceed? Rarely is it the case, even in Indian thought, that their degree of reality is outright denied. But are the many separate existences in their own right? Or do they only exist to some extent by virtue of participation in unity? Again, how do we have existential access to unity? Is it via the sense that we are merged with the cosmos? Or is it via the deep self, together with the sense that all things are identical with this self, whose ultimate ground is God? In Western terms, one might say, should one go with Spinoza or with Fichte? But Ram-Prasad will show us that there have been equivalent tensions outside the West. Either intuition, the cosmic one, or the idealist one, might encourage us towards an ultimate immanence or pantheism. But if both intuitions contain truth, then perhaps the absolute transcends both the finite self and the known cosmos. This double intuition tends to mesh with the Neoplatonic, but also with the Vedantic notion that the ultimate exceeds immanence, but that finite things and finite selves emanate from or participate in this ultimate, which is God. And then there is the question of whether, if the many are also real to some degree, then the ultimate unity, in order to be a unity that can give rise to diversity, must exceed our normal contrast of identity and difference. This question has been explored in the West in the Platonic tradition, up to and including the Romantics, and by much Trinitarian theology. Yet, as we shall also see, it is not a question alien to the mysticism and speculation of non-Western religious traditions. A quick word about housekeeping. We are being recorded during the lecture, but not during the questions, which also indicates that we will be having some questions afterwards. And tomorrow's lecture will be in a sort of pair with today's. So some of Ram's answers maybe come to the lecture tomorrow. Okay, Professor Chakravarthi, Ram-Prasad, welcome and over to you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, not only for your generous words, but also for the superb way in which you set up the larger questions that are in play here. My thanks also to the electors of the Stanton lectures. Just to give you a quick word about how things are going to go. Today, probably a little less time for questions because this lecture is twinned with tomorrow's, and the sort of the foil between the ideas explored today and tomorrow is really the point that I'm trying to convey in this pair. And so we're going to, as you can see, have three pairs of topics over the next 6 lectures. But even more than that, before we get to that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time framing what I see to be the issue here, some of which has already been touched on by Catherine, and also something about the rather lunatic methodology I have followed in ranging across these traditions, which I possibly could not know in equal measure, why I'm doing it. So I'll take the first 10-12 minutes to do that, and then I'll start on the first of our pairs of comparison, finish today with the first comparator, who's Shankara, the classical Indian thinker. We'll have a little bit of time, but as I said, it's much more likely that things will look a little bit clearer after tomorrow's talk, which will be on the Chinese Taoist thinker, Zhuangzi. So let me begin. I'm in a way rephrasing what Catherine's already done, which is this idea that in our experience, we have what I call the obduracy of manyness. What is given in our experience? I'm located in a world, I, who feel somehow in this world, but distinct from it. And then there is a world of hard-edged plurality, many things, many beings, many requiring different ontological categories. There is something fundamentally different, it would seem, in our day-to-day intuitions between numbers and objects, between emotions and stars. Now, when we start with that unchallengeable experience of being one amongst many in a world of manyness, what do? I can be comfortable with this fact and seek how to live with it, or, as Catherine was indicating, and as many of the traditions of the world have done, I can question whether this is how things truly are, whether how I live should be on the basis of taking for granted how things are in my ordinary experience. So then you have these options, very broadly speaking. You can accept plurality as ontological, to take manyness, diversity, plot it out, and taking that stability for granted, taking the givenness of experience for granted, start looking at what our epistemological and moral tasks are. In a sense, this is a worldview which long ago, 60 years ago, Peter Strawson called a descriptive metaphysical approach. We describe the world, and as a consequence of our careful description of the many things that occupy us in our experience, we are able to think about what a theory of mind looks like, what perception is and how it functions, and what its consequences are, and how it delivers knowledge, how we are to be good in this world, how are we to act in it, what are the kinds of rituals which we should participate in, and so on. Or you could have a questioning of plurality, asking whether the apparent is the real, whether the manyness of our experience is the starting point of ontology, that the ontological task is the description. If we think not, and many traditions have not, then we have the contrast to a descriptive approach, because a revisionary approach, which is to say, well, if the world isn't something that I start with and plot and then check the consequences of, then my epistemological and moral tasks, how I am to know and how I am to know how to act and act well, has to be revisionary from the beginning, because reality itself is something other than what I take it to be. It must be explained. It must be explained why there are stars and emotions and tables and so forth. However, that is not my given. There is something that needs to be explored beyond it. So oneness is the loose term I give to what results with the vision of irreducible, what results with the questioning, of the results of irreducible plurality. Now, not all revisionary metaphysics delivers a view of oneness, but any account that asserts oneness or seeks oneness or takes oneness to be the point, the teleology of our lives, is revisionary, because it manifestly is the case that experience as we have it is cluttered with manyness. That's the barest, most abstract outline I can give, because I'm trying to say something which will be consistent for all the different kinds of views you're going to encounter in these weeks. Having said that very general, having set up that very general picture, I recognize there are many modes of questioning. There is a further question, a meta question of what is subject to question and what the responses are, how consequential they have been to those thinkers who have come up with answers for them. And so my most important caveat at this point is to say that I do not claim that there is one or oneness, or that I'm giving an account which brings everything together. My search is not for a perennialism that says, this is what was found here and this is what was found here, and they are the same thing. My concern is not so much with trying to give you an account of oneness, the kind of a meta oneness that I'm looking at, which is what are the ways, what are the frameworks? How have people across time and space approached this very broad notion of challenging the obdurate manyness of our ordinary experience, or the experiential givenness of plurality, however you want to put it. So my interest is really not in trying to give you an account of oneness, but rather to look at the ways of oneness. But in doing so, I'm immediately embarking, and as you would see from the titles of my talk, on a comparative enterprise. And comparison itself can take many different points. The hoary problem of comparison is always, from a point of expertise, two questions. How is one located with regard to the comparators? And what does one need to know? So these are the things that have always been challenged, perhaps in the last 200 years, and birth of the comparative method in the study of religion. So I'll just give very quick answers and get them out of the way. How is one located with regard to the comparators? Classic question, a theological answer might be that one needs to belong existentially to one of the two views being compared. I'm not denying that I have an existential location in some ways. I'm born in the Sri Vaishnava tradition of Ramanuja, one of the people we're going to be looking at later. But I'm not, in fact, developing a Sri Vaishnava or a Vishishtadvaitika qualified non-dualist view of oneness. I bracket that, and I am not committing myself to an existential point of view when it comes to the exploration in the lecture. And what does one need to know? So the ambitious, restrictive answer, the answer that very often, much of my career I've lived with, is that in order to make a comparison, in order to work across two traditions, if not just to compare them side by side, but to think new thoughts, to make determinate conclusions, I must know both sides of the comparison. I must be located epistemologically in a place where I have studied them to a relatively equal amount. But I suggest that there is a radically different, a humble answer, which is that one might know a comparator, but without framing the other in terms of the one you know better, an all too easy danger and trap to fall into, one can approach something else that one does not know, provisionally, tentatively, to widen one's own horizons, not to come to determinate conclusions or weigh in on what the answer to the question of oneness is. So, as an academic, quite apart from my personal position, I come from a Sanskrit Hindu background of scholarship, and I worked on Sanskrit texts for much of my life. And although I have done comparative work, actually none of the three thinkers I'm comparing Sanskrit thinkers to have been my focus of comparison over the past 30, 35 years. I worked primarily on analytic and phenomenological Western traditions in comparative. So I'm coming to the thinkers I'm comparing to answer Spinoza and Ibn Arabi through widely differing and definitely lower levels of scholarly understanding. I have, with the exception of some amount of classical Chinese, I don't know Arabic. So I've been dependent on, and even if you say Spinoza translations are stable enough for Western scholarship, I'm certainly coming at all these three thinkers reliant on secondary scholarship, on careful reading of different translations, going back to what I can access of the original key terminology and so forth, but never as I would with offering my own translations of the Sanskrit. So the reason I think I want to do this is to offer a kind of an invitation for people who are scholars and experts in a tradition. I've often had conversations where people have been willing to listen to me about what I'm saying about a Sanskrit scholar, but they themselves, of course, have spent their lifetime working on, say, Greek and Latin and so forth. So what do you do? Well, how do we move from our respective islands of expertise? We can listen, of course, respectfully to each other, But what about finding out for ourselves how things stand? Provided we are not overambitious, provided we don't think that spending a few years or even a few months reading some material carefully could give us answers equivalent to the sense of confidence and nuance that we might get after 20 years, 30 years of reading material, provided we don't make those kinds of assumptions, provided we are humble, provided we are probational, learning something that we are really profoundly ignorant of further into our careers is an exhilarating moment of freedom. To think we can be disoriented in ways that are existentially important. To feel actually the familiar patterns of epistemic progress that we've got used to, reading more texts of the sorts that we already know, and throwing ourselves into the deep end, is something where even the sensation of drowning is life-giving. That's a paradox there. So what I'm going to be doing in these pairs of lectures are 3 modes of engagement, 3 pairs of comparisons, and 3 different saliences of oneness. As I said, I'm going to be talking about ways. I'm more interested in ways of oneness rather than any account of oneness. I'm going to contrast Shankara and Chuang-Tzu. I'm going to suggest that 11th century Kashmiri thinker called Abhinavagupta provides an interesting complementarity in his approach to the question of monism with Spinoza. And then I'm going to finish with suggesting a straight comparison of particular points, not of the many potential ones, between the 12th century theologian Ramanuja and his near contemporary Ibn Arabi from the Islamic, from the mystical Sufi tradition. And I'm going to say that there is a way in which we can compare some very profound ways in which they tackle the question of the relationship of oneness, God, and being. So that, by way of preliminary and way of framing. So, from now, we're going to be talking about this particular, perhaps the most provocative idea of a contrasting response to what I think structurally is a rather similar problem. At least I'm going to argue it's a structurally similar problem. What I call the idea of overcoming difference. And this is the response between comparative, contrasting responses of Shankara and Chuang-Tzu. So this is my analysis of the problem that each of them takes to be confronted. So you find yourself a monad in a world of hard-edged manyness. You have a sense of estrangement. What are you in this world? What is the world to you? How do you resolve that sense that you're not at one with this world? Many others have felt this. Many mystical responses have sought to answer it. I deliberately picked Chuang-Tzu rather than the many kinds of comparisons, straight comparisons we could make with Shankara, especially in Western mystical traditions, Eckhart, for example, Cusanus, and so on. I've deliberately chosen the Chinese thinker, Taoist thinker Chuang-Tzu, because it's like, from my perspective, they find themselves looking at the same question, this uneasy sense of being estranged from the world, this riotous world, all kinds of things happening in it. You ask yourself, who am I in this world? What is this world for me? And they head off in exactly the opposite direction. And because they head off in the opposite direction, what they propose as their resolution to the sense of estrangement is exactly the opposite too. So you'd appreciate now why it might take a little bit of time for this contrast to unfold, and perhaps some of what I'm trying to say about Shankara will make more sense after we've looked at Chuang-Tzu tomorrow. So, the Shankara we'll be talking about, perhaps one of the best known thinkers of the Hindu tradition from the 8th century, whose major commentary called the Brahma Sutra Bhashya is on a set of enigmatic statements about two key concepts that have been part of the Hindu tradition almost from the beginning: the concept of Brahman, an absolute principle, an ultimate explanatory principle of reality, and self, again, whatever self means, the Atman. He also wrote other works on the Bhagavad Gita, independent works. There are many works attributed to him which modern scholarship does not think were his, but shows, of course, that from a very early stage, perhaps within a century after his death, his work had become extremely influential. So the key concept that Shankara is always working on is this incredibly fecund and yet utterly mysterious notion of Brahman. Brahman is the sole truth. So I'm going to be giving my own translations of well-established texts. His texts are well-established and stable, so there's no many translations of them. So in this, the Bhashya, the commentary on one of the ancient 8th century BCE texts, the Mundaka, says Brahman is the sole truth. Everything else is modification. Modification initiated by language, merely names. The rest is unreal. Brahman alone is the unity of this world. So he's striving right away, as you can see in this text, he's striving to look beyond this manyness. Of course, what he means by unreal and real kept the thinkers of his tradition occupied for the next 1,000 years, as us now. My thesis on what he meant by unreal. But I'm not really interested in the details of that metaphysics. What I'm really trying to just key you into is this urge on Shankara's part to use the concept of Brahman to look beyond manyness, to have this utter conviction that there is an order of reality and an order of explanation which can be realized beyond, behind, under, whatever spatial metaphor we want, the manyness we find in experience. And then from a comment from his commentary on the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, another the major, most important Upanishad, probably about 1000 BCE, he's writing on this 1800 years later. There are many distinct varieties of conscious and unconscious forms, universals and particulars. So in a sense, he's like saying, I'm not going to get bothered by ontology. You can do your ontology. You can have a way in which you can make a distinction between, how love exists and how the spoon exists. What is outside my mental map and what is within. What is the relationship between mental activity and perceptual activity? You can map manyness. There are many distinct varieties of these forms. They are arranged in a hierarchy, according to your ends. You could say inside, outside, closer, further out, more basic, less basic, higher order, lower order, foundational, whatever. But the important point is they are encompassed within a single general principle, which is nothing but what you call essential consciousness. And that consciousness is Brahman. Chit uses this very potent word that goes back to the Upanishads, Chit, which translates normally as consciousness, but clearly how it's going to be interpreted is going to take us in very different direction. Is this a form of idealism? Is it absolute idealism? Perceptual idealism? Is it panpsychism? We can go off in different directions trying to explain what Shankara means when he fills in consciousness, because it's not clearly what we normally say is consciousness. Again, that's not where I want to go now. That's not the path. Again, written on that elsewhere. what I'm trying to point out here is whatever that explanation, however he seeks to fill in what Brahman might mean, the point is that there is some unifying principle. So our ontologies, however detailed they are, don't get at that. That's what he's interested in. How do you get it? And this is the problem. So in a very famous passage about one of the most important sayings, one of the most mysterious sayings in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and it says, all that can be said about Brahman is not this, not this. He says, not this, as the designation of reality. Refers to that which has no distinguishing features of name, form, action, difference, class, property, quality, all the things that go into your ontologies. Brahman has no distinguishing feature. Because as soon as you distinguish, you start making, you're moving into manyness. Distinction simply is the creation, the generation of manyness. And I'm trying to de-differentiate. So it's not possible to describe it positively as this or that, and only through superimposition. So as soon as you start using words, say it's the absolute, it's the one, it's what we should realize. Even those very words which are striving to go past manyness are still all the time generating the very manyness that is supposed to be transcended. Devoid of limiting conditions, the generativity of our concepts, there is only one way left, the designation, not this, by the negation of all possible descriptions. And of course, that's a tension that many mystics of oneness always reach. So if you are saying that even the first concept that you articulate, even the conditions for the possibility of the articulation of a concept requires two-ness, manyness, then you're always left in the performative contradiction of wanting to say that beyond the manyness, under the manyness, is the oneness. But already that description carries with it the seeds of its own self-destruction. Therefore, in a sense, all you can do as you proceed is to say, not that concept, not even the biggest, bestest concept of oneness you can find is enough, not that too. So it's always a lesson to all the teachers, and many other stories about teachers who come up with, here is it, I found the explanation, Brahman is this. And the wiser person says, not this. So that you have to be held with. So it's a process rather than a conclusion by the very definition of what generates meanings. So that is all we can say about Brahman. It is that plenitude which lies beyond every possible categorization, including this one. So, who am I in all of this? The one who's asking all these questions. So right from the beginning of the Upanishads, this question haunted the thinkers as much as did the question, what is all this? Why is all this? Why is anything there? All of that always brought with it this question of, who am I? Who's asking these questions? What even is making such inquiry possible? So one of the answers he gives many is perpetually seeing the transitory visions of dreaming and waking states through impressions and perceptions respectively. Self becomes the seer of seeing. This being so, seeing is its own nature as heat is fire's. There is no further conscious seer apart from the seeing. So what Shankara is doing is just developing the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad's insight that as with Brahman and the path of the Via Negativa, you have the same kind of question in a way of trying to isolate who is asking this question. Because as soon as you ask the question, you're rendering the self into an object. That's not self. Self is perpetually the seeing, the question. So apart from the process of trying to find self. There is no other self to be found. So this is a puzzle, of course, because it is the thing that is known best and the thing that is known least. Because it is not possible for the knower to know the knower, because the knower is not an object. If by knowing you mean performing a particular kind of epistemological procedure and arriving at a conclusion in accordance with your definition of knowledge, and there are many, many of those, you, of course, need an object. But as we've already started to think, what Atman means is never that object. It is not possible for the knower to know the knower, just as the fire cannot burn the fire. There is no knower other than Brahman, for whom Brahman can be a separate object of knowledge, a knower. So the thought, I know Brahman well, is an illusion. And this is a major sort of jump that was obvious to the authors of the Upanishads, which Shankara takes up very seriously, which is actually you don't have two sets of questions about what is all this, what is the truth, what is the ultimate, and who am I asking this? These are not two categories of questions. Actually, self, Atman, is no different from Brahman. The asking seer and what makes seer seer is the same, or rather, there's no difference. Not exactly that they are the same, there's no difference. That is to say, we can hold together two different categories. They are categories, one called Atman and one called Brahman. And the definitions under which we talk about this, about Atman, and the definitions under which we talk about Brahman are separate. These are two conceptual categories, but they are not different. If you said they were one, then you have problems of what identity means. See, that's why Shankara's school is called Advaita, non-duality. There is no difference between the two, and yet, of course, we have to continue using these concepts. Now, it is an illusion, therefore, to make an object of the one explanatory principle. That's the problem. It seems like you can think very hard and you're getting to the point of an explanation. This is essential consciousness. This is eternal. This is no different from the self within me. It seems as if these answers, which are given in the sacred texts themselves, are answers. But no, they're always undermined by the consideration, by the awareness that they are concepts. They can function only in a generative economy of manyness. Therefore, it's an illusion to think that there is knowledge to be had this way. All conduct, ordinary and sacred, regarding knowledge and its object starts by presupposing that mutual superimposition of the self and the non-self, which is termed avidya, which is primal misunderstanding. So too, this is Shankara's biggest claim, all sacred texts concerned with injunctions, prohibition, liberation, that is to say, all the activities of the religious life given by the sacred texts themselves, are all part of this superimposition to think that the seer, that Brahman, the one, and the many through which it is necessarily taught are somehow identifiable. But yes, of course, we do that as soon as we're told what to pray. What are the rituals that have to be conducted at which time? What should not be done? What are errors? What are the right things to do at the right time? Everything that holds up life, not just religious life, specifically, of course, the religious life. All of that is generated through that conceptual mechanism by which you put the one and the many into a kind of mutual superimposition, which is again a term of art for Shankara and his followers. So he famously asserts at the very start of the introduction to his major commentary on the Brahma Sutras, which are the compilation views of the Upanishads. It is not a matter requiring proof that object and subject, whose spheres are respectively the notions of you, not self, and I, self, opposed as darkness and light, or you could say as manyness and oneness, cannot be one another. Consequently, the superimposition of the subject, which has for its sphere the notion of I, and is of the nature of consciousness, and of the qualities of the object, which has for its sphere the notion of the non-I, and conversely, that superimposition is incorrect. Nevertheless, it is of the nature of worldly transactions effected by that fundamental miscognition to not distinguish the entities and their qualities, and instead to superimpose their natures and qualities on each other, and coupling the true with the untrue to think, I am this is mine. So, what Shankara wants to say in the very beginning, although many of these statements are in fact reworked and challenged by him later on, there is a big idea that he wants to start with, which is everything you do all the time is this tussle with manyness. Because as soon as you articulate any thought, I am inquiring into the nature of Brahman, which is what the texts ask me to do. I am inquiring. Who's the I? What is inquiry? What does inquiry require? What is the set of ideas that informs the very nature of inquiry? What is the I and what is Brahman? You couldn't articulate that sentence without already saying, I am this, the inquirer into Brahman. On the one hand, impeccably the right sentence. The text asked you to inquire into Brahman. So you say, I am this inquirer into Brahman. We're off already down the wrong path. You cannot help it. You have to do this. But this is miscognition. So you live in this condition where you cannot but be wandering in the realm of manyness. Because as soon as you recognize that there is a problem with manyness, you're already in it. So what are you going to do? Because it seems like you've been told by the sacred texts, you've been reassured that self, Brahman, Atman, Brahman, and world are, in fact, they're not in a real dialogue. The world is really not the world as we take it to be. There is only Brahman. There is only self. These are the texts you live by. But as soon as you articulate them, you are finding yourself in this condition of wrestling with many. So what are you going to do in such a condition? What Shankara does is go looking for how transformation from this inescapable condition of wrestling with manyness can happen. It is what might broadly be called selflessness. Like heat with fire, mental experiences such as happiness, sorrow, and delusion pertaining to all objects, although born as though grasped by the consciousness that is self, are properly distinguished by self, that is of the nature of eternal consciousness, as distinct from it. So what he is saying is, the real problem is not in your ordinary life. The inescapability of manyness, that the very articulation of the problem of how to get to the one is already riddled with one manyness. That's not the problem, because that's the condition of your life. The real challenge is how consciousness can continually be aware of itself as not, in fact, participating in this illusory economy of oneness. It will carry on happening. But consciousness must distinguish itself. So here is an example from the Gita, commentary on the Gita. The thought, I am happy, the thing that you think is said with reasonable certainty by most of us when we say that, produces a conjunction between happiness, that is an object, and self, that is subject, which is in fact a false association of the latter with happiness. It says, take something like happiness, a warm, fuzzy feeling, a whole set of phenomenological responses, maybe a particular set of thoughts, poem remembered, a memory sparked, whatever that seems to be so close to the consciousness that entertains it, that it seems like I am happy, is one of the innermost things that you could say. It says, no. Even at that point of what looks like the greatest intimacy of self-knowledge, there are two things there. There is self and there is happiness, and happiness is actually an object of consciousness. Of course, later thinkers then spent a lot of time trying to defend this view that to feel happy is to actually take happiness as an object, and then there were other questions about whether this pertained to all happiness, etc. Again, not wanting to go down the path of looking at whether that's a defensible idea. The thought I want to keep in our minds is how the response to this closeness of manyness for the seeker of oneness is not somehow to dispense with that, because it's there all the time. It's a condition of ordinary existence. But rather to prepare and discipline consciousness so that it is always in its state of self-awareness, distinguishing between itself as itself and all the things that it associates with itself. There are many types of happinesses, many forms of it. They are therefore objects, and therefore they are part of the world. So even what seems closest to you is not, in fact, that Brahman, Atman, which is the one. It is because, he says, action is wrongly superimposed on self through primal misunderstanding, that it has been said, say, by the Gita, that the unwise person never, not even for a moment, is capable of completely letting go of action. Because you're always in the world of manyness. But the wise person is able to let go of action completely. Because by action, he doesn't mean physical action, but rather the adherence to the consequences of action. Different question again. But the wise person is able to let go of action completely when misunderstanding has been dispelled by this gnosis, jnana, which is the gnosis of consciousness being self-conscious. But then it is not possible for there to be any remnant of what has been hitherto wrongly superimposed. Again, untangling this is a really complicated task, which sustainability has been questioned, of course, by all the opponents of the Advaita system. But what I'm trying to get at is this key, this idea of being selfless as the core of self, according to Shankara, which is that as soon as you say self is, you're saying it's something else. And that is what keeps you in the ambit of manyness. That misunderstanding that there is in fact such manyness and I, the self, is always associated with it, is what has to be given up. How is it given up? Is it possible? Opponents ask. What is the state of consciousness that you say is free of any of these states? You can't point it out by definition, etc. So of course there are lots of questions. I'm just trying to follow Shankara through to this idea that when you're wrestling with the intimate manyness that makes you who you think you are, there has to be a disciplining of consciousness that lets go of it. How it's done, what it looks like, a different question. I just want you to keep thinking about this insight that he has, that whatever it is, there has to be this paradox that to be self is to be selfless. Because as soon as you say what self is, you're in the realm of the many. You are associating with happiness and things and objects of various sorts. That's very important because, as we'll see, in a dramatically different way, Chuang Tzu also raises this question of how easy it is for us to feel that who we are is to do with a bunch of things to do with us, and how we get out of that into this paradoxical sense of selflessness being the point of self. He does ask himself this question: if the objective of humans is achieved through right cognition alone, should they who become liberated perform action that involves strenuous effort? Why pray? Why meditate? Why perform austerity? There is a saying, why should one go to the mountain for honey when the honey is at hand? And this is always a question that is asked of proponents of whatever form of oneness. Say, if oneness is already the case, why are we banging our head trying to look beyond everything? You know, it's not like you're taking us from a world called manyness to another world called oneness. You're saying things are one. So why isn't it there? A slightly more ambivalent statement here. Is he endorsing or questioning? It is the self of all. Self is itself all this. This is how sacred texts have characterized Brahman. And it can therefore never be held to be something towards which movement is possible. One cannot go to where one already is. So, what he's saying, therefore, is he's acknowledging the challenge here. There has to be something happening in our normal awareness, which is riddled with manyness, to this point where there is that consciousness which is one. But it's not an attainment. It cannot be an attainment because that suggests that it isn't always the case that there is only one absolute principle, Brahman. Because that will then undermine the whole idea. The whole idea is that what you take to be the world of manyness is not really there. What is really truly there is always already Brahman. How do I get there without having to go anywhere? And that's always a challenge. Again, many proponents are going to wrestle with this idea. It's got to be something that you are now, that isn't a kind of getting somewhere else. And again, that's something to keep in mind, because Chuang Tzu is going to sort of recognize this problem and offer a different solution to it. So the headline answer Shankara gives, and its defense concerns not only him, but of course his followers, is that this gnosis, jnana of self, this consciousness within consciousness of itself alone, is the cause of the highest good. Through the idea of the removal of difference, it delivers the fruit of singularity. How do you get something without having to go for it? You have simply to stop having the idea you already have. It's at once intuitive and baffling. But this is how you square the circle. There has to, at least for Shankara, which is that consciousness itself must cease to have the modes of functioning which generate the manyness, the idea of difference between consciousness and all that is not. In a sense, in ordinary life, we could say it's like when you see something, a picture that you've seen for all times. It's like people have talked about it. It's like a just talked switch or with a Rorschach blot when you suddenly see something different. People have tried, and in fact, rough analogies of this were given by later advocates. Say it was already there, and yet you see how steam changes. Shankara was writing in a much more abstract way because he was trying to articulate this notion that it's not something you do. It's in a way almost it's a stopping of what consciousness does, which is to generate the idea of difference. So what is, which is oneness all the time. There's not a time when oneness wasn't. But you are not going to attain it through your actions, through adherence to all the rules of the sacred texts. In fact, there is no distinction between freedom and bondage. The sort of thing that led him open to being accused by his opponents of being a crypto-Buddhist. This is what Nagarjuna said. To some extent, that's true. There's no distinction between freedom and bondage, for self is eternally the same, not that part. That Nagarjuna rejected. But this idea that if you follow through this consequence of erroneousness as the condition in which consciousness operates, and erroneousness is the conceptual generation of oneness, then really nothing is changed. Really, there is always freedom. There is no difference between freedom and bondage. But the miscognition regarding it is dispelled by the cognition born of the teachings of the text. Only prior to getting such instruction is it appropriate to strive for the goal of liberation. Just look, in ordinary life, you being a religious person, you say you wake up in the morning and you perform this ritual and you go to the temple and you do all the things that the good religious life is about. And then you're confronted by these texts and the teacher who says, actually, you are living in this world of manyness, which is in some profound way wrong. Actually, there is only Atman Brahman. So then you have to stop thinking that the highest spiritual goal is to run around performing your religious tasks. You start concentrating on this. But as soon as you do, you're going to embark on this much more arduous problem that the teacher who told you and the text that taught you and the way you articulate it are themselves examples of precisely what you have to go beyond. How do you do that? And so the non-dualist's path is to somehow keep stripping away all the necessary conditions of thinking about the untaught. So you can say it's not that, it's not that. And those are kind of practices of reflexivity. But at the end, there has to be that knowledge of which is not knowledge. It's not knowledge because it's not objective. It's a transformation of consciousness in which things remain the same, and yet consciousness is in itself one or not different. It's not in the world of manyness anymore. So if that is reached, then through that transformation of knowledge that is not knowledge, that's some kind of attainment of consciousness which is not an attainment, the world is dissolved. The world of manyness isn't there. The world that obdurately, even to the subtlest thinker, still stays out there as this hard table. The table's hardness is really irrelevant now. What there is only consciousness. So the world dissolving into self, Atman and Brahman, self and absolute, is a world that remains obdurate for those for where consciousness hasn't had that transformation. It doesn't, as it were, dissolve in any experiential way. But consciousness is aware of itself as not many. So Shankara offers this very rigorous, very abstract and very demanding notion of how to tackle the obduracy of manyness, which is, he says, something happens in consciousness by which it destroys the conditions with which it normally functions. Those, in fact, a later commentator of his, Vachaspati, says exactly that the liberative consciousness is the one that is on the brink of its own destruction. But if we step back and use all the perilously sort of conceptualizing language that, as philosophers, we do, Shankara's response to the problem is to say there is a point at which that consciousness, which is the innermost, assimilates this world of manyness into itself. So what is left is Atman Brahman, that consciousness which is asking questions of the world of manyness. What I hope to show you tomorrow is that faced with this world of manyness, Chuang-Tzu chooses a diametrically opposed answer.
Very much. A few minutes then, questions. People.
Just a second, should we just